My name is Matt Conloff. I'm one of the members of the organizing committee for the lecture series. The real mover and shaker behind the California Water Colloquium is Professor Narasimhan, who is not with us this evening. But this was his brainchild, and the idea is to have lectures from a variety of disciplines: natural sciences, social sciences, humanities, engineering, and look at water from a variety of perspectives. And we're very pleased tonight to have Jim Wescoat speak. Jim is now the head of the Landscape Architecture Department at University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana. He is new there this year after spending 13 years at University of Colorado in the Department of Geography. And this straddling the fence between landscape architecture and geography is an old habit of his. Jim actually did his undergraduate degree in landscape architecture. His PhD was in geography at University of Chicago, and his research interests have also been in both areas. And Jim does research on water policy in the West. His dissertation was on the Colorado River Basin, and he's continued to work in that area. He was also chair of a very high-profile and I think insightful panel on the Colorado River and the restoration program for the Colorado River. They produced a book that was called Downstream, right? That was the report of this National Research Council committee. Very well received, and I think in addition to Jim's work in the water policy area, then you have another side of his research interests, which have to do with how water has been used in landscapes, and particularly in Islamic gardens. He's done some very important pioneering work in looking at the role of water, especially in Mughal gardens in India, which of course Taj Mahal is the most famous example. He's also worked on Roman water law. He had a Rome Prize in which he studied that. And I used to remember more of these various things, but that's probably enough to give you an idea of Jim Wescoat's research interests and accomplishments. And anyway, it's great for him to make the trip out to Berkeley once again and to be here. Thanks, Jim.
Thanks very much, Matt, and thanks to the California Water Colloquium and to everyone who's come this evening. I'm going to start and thank you all for inviting me, notwithstanding the topic of tonight's conversation on the waterworks of the Taj Mahal, which might, at least initially, seem somewhat far afield from California water. If you'll keep this image in mind, these are some of the water systems that classically one wants to understand in a complex like the Taj Mahal in India. And we'll progressively try to go through different perspectives on this water system that also I'll want to suggest have a bearing for various types of landscape heritage conservation in the western US and other parts of the world. So the title this evening, Water and Landscape Heritage Conservation and Design, Lessons, and this is an adjustment from the original, both for and from the Taj Mahal. And I'll be concentrating primarily on some of these questions of landscape heritage conservation. And to a lesser extent, some of the issues of basic scientific research, physical and social scientific research, issues of policy analysis, and of landscape design, which are relevant to the conservation challenges at the Taj Mahal. Is it visible from the back, sufficient contrast? Or would you like to cut off a couple of lights towards the back of the room? It's up to you all. So speak up if you... Better? Okay. By the way, how many people have had an opportunity to visit the Taj Mahal in the course of their travels? So a couple, and I'll provide some background so that the imagination of this place is something that we'll really try to cultivate in the next, say, 30, 40 minutes. If you are associated with the Water Resources Archive here on campus and with its materials, you'll know just how much of a international exchange has taken place over the past really more than 2 centuries between the Western United States and other parts of the world, in particular South Asia. And in other studies, I've published some work on these international exchanges that run the gamut from questions of trade and irrigation agriculture to more recently watershed organizations, what succeeds and what fails, recent joint seminars on the cultural politics of water. My brother-in-law, Bailey Green, on wastewater engineering works in both India and California. The connections are numerous and really not as widely recognized in the scholarly literature by those of us who will concentrate on one region as compared with multiple regions. And while some of the previous work is concentrated on the exchange of technologies, of water laws, of policies, and of various kinds of economic and institutional innovations, what I'll try to do tonight builds upon yet another theme in California water resources research, and I include this title of a book that was authored by Bert Linton and his colleagues, and then there was similar types of work concerned with the aesthetics of water and landscape research by Leopold and his students. And now Matt Kondolf and Asaf Rahman are also working on jointly problems of river restoration and in ecological as well as visual terms. So this theme within California has been really a source of innovation here, and it has applicability and parallels in other parts of the world, including South Asia. How many are familiar with this volume, by the way? Okay, a few. So I recommend it to everyone because this is one of the classic studies on the aesthetics of water, which was crucial to the, at least one of the environmental movements of this past century. And what I'm trying to do in the lecture is perhaps well represented by the diagram here on types of landscape exchange between South Asia and North America. And if we think about this question of lessons from the Taj Mahal for various parts of the Western US, we're in the realm of kind of 21st century thinking, looking at a two-region, what I would call a two-region comparison. It involves basically standing in a position like this where you're trying to imagine what kinds of lessons can we take from these unquestionably beautiful waterworks of the Taj Mahal, but nevertheless, if you try to say, well, what's the applicability in other parts of the world, even other parts of India, that's an extremely difficult question to answer. And it's one that requires that one be able to kind of look back at and reconstruct some of the earlier history of this site and how its waterworks were developed and what it meant in its own terms and time in the 17th century, be able to kind of track the history of interactions between the two regions over the course of centuries, and then be able to draw these kinds of parallels or comparisons between the two regions as a way of kind of coming to some conclusion about the modern relevance of medieval waterworks. The research that I'm going to describe tonight is part of a project that's at the bottom of the list here on recent Taj Mahal conservation studies. For the past 2 years, there's a group that's been called the Taj Mahal Conservation Collaborative. And this is a joint project organized by the Archaeological Survey of India and the Indian Hotels Corporation Limited, which is part of the Tata Industries Group. It's an attempt to try to get a public-private partnership on heritage conservation, enormously controversial, very difficult to achieve, both in in public terms as well as in technical terms. But this is happening in several major places around India, the most advanced of which is Humayun's tomb. But the Taj Mahal group started and is launched, and they've organized as part of that a set of international advisors and critics, of which my role is related to the gardens and water systems of the Taj complex. This effort is building upon work that was really initiated several decades ago by concerns about the potential effects and actual effects of atmospheric pollution on the marbles of the Taj Mahal. And those atmospheric pollutants were generated by a whole array of industrial as well as local urban contaminants. It's from the early technical studies in the late 70s to the really path-breaking litigation that was brought by MC Mehta in the mid-1980s that's continued all the way to the present. This is a type of public interest litigation on behalf of the people of India and the monument of the Taj Mahal. If you are looking or wondering about another California-India connection related to the Taj Mahal, it turns out that MC Mehta was the recipient of the Goldman Prize here in San Francisco in 1996. He's also speaking at Bolt Hall, just coincidentally, tomorrow afternoon at 12 noon. So anyone who is interested in these issues of environmental policy and law in South Asia and internationally would be really well recommended to see this extraordinary activist and lawyer tomorrow afternoon. So that work, whoops, I'm sorry, that work was followed by a joint project with the U.S. National Park Service and the Uttar Pradesh Tourism Development Ministry. And the National Park Service, I think, would agree with the assessment that they really stepped into a policy maelstrom, that they didn't even really comprehend the magnitude of conflict and the complexities institutionally, culturally, as well as technically that were associated with any historic monument, and no place more so than the Taj Mahal. Nevertheless, they produced a Agra Heritage Project Plan and report, and they commissioned several technical studies of the water resources of the Agra area that are valuable in their own right as surface water and groundwater studies, but they were an indicator of some of what's been lacking in landscape heritage conservation, which is a coherent perspective on water. The components were all broken up into different pieces, but when you ask how do these different aspects of the hydrologic cycle and waterworks of the system kind of come together in some coherent way, there was none of that evident in these earlier studies, and even to the present day, that's the real challenge. This was so controversial that we had a international Indo-US Blue Ribbon Commission that was established, and that commission just suggested that given all of the controversies, it would be very wise if just one site could be studied scientifically, and that the archaeology of these gardens and waterworks would be studied to try to understand really how the place was built and what kinds of plants had been planted and how the water system worked. And on that one, I was fortunate to be involved as the waterworks person. That was a study that culminated in a project known as the Moonlight Garden project. The Smithsonian published this about a year ago. Subsequently, there have been other technical studies, but up to the present day, we have it's a continuing problem with just what sorts of conceptual approaches are most needed to the historic waterworks of a place like the Taj Mahal. Waterworks such as these, and this is an image of the excavated Mehtab Bagh or Moonlight Garden across the river from the Taj Mahal complex. Some of the questions that we might ask when we start to say, well, how would one begin to develop some more coherent approach might be gained by looking at the way things used to be done and then to generate and start to develop an alternative. In the Maytab Bog project, when we looked and asked how has historic waterworks conservation been approached, we found that in India, as elsewhere internationally, it tends to be a materials-based approach. So if the problem is associated with brick or stonework, then the technical questions of how you conserve bricks, mortars, and stone weathering would be the challenge. And in the South Asian context, both India and Pakistan, there's a very strong inclination to reconstruct these waterworks, waterproof them, and fill them. There's a passion that people have for getting the fountains to play and the works to be filled again, which is really detrimental to this scientific understanding if it's all repaved before it's understood properly. Similarly, there's technical work to be done on various aspects of the wells that supported these garden systems and urban systems, the piping, which was often terracotta-based. There's ornamental marble and metal work in the fountains and pools themselves. And then the gardens, which consume an enormous amount of water through irrigation and which have their own science and conservation needs. At the bottom of this, I don't know if it's quite legible, but the array of materials and the array of approaches is so diverse that this conventional approach is going to be technically and scientifically, it's fragmented. And just by the way things will proceed using this approach. So the question would be, how do we start to put these pieces of the puzzle together? And in the Maytab Bog project, for that one garden site across the river from the Taj Mahal, the approach that was taken was one that we came to call following the water. And it's a very simple, it'd be familiar to anyone in the water resources field. But first we start with questions of water demand. How much does this garden and its waterworks require in the way of water supplies to bring about the effects that one wants to have and the experiences one wants to have with these water systems. And then one proceeds to questions about how the supplies would actually provide the waters to make those, to achieve those experiences and effects. And it goes through a progression of studies that very simply from climatic water budget analysis to looking at the both the technologies of water lifting and then the hydraulics of water transport and the head that you get from the fountains. And then you start to, along with that more hydrologic and hydraulic analysis, interweave questions about the poetics of water experience. And the main source for that were inscriptions from the Taj Mahal Complex itself. There's an enormously rich program of calligraphic, architectural calligraphy with passages from the Quran, selected verses of which deal with the waters of the world. It goes far beyond that complex, but it was something that we were able to draw out and ask and cite that when you're thinking about irrigation, the surah of the Quran that speaks about a sign for them is the land that is dead. We do bring it life. Through irrigation, through providing water, which is seen as a sign of Allah's mercy for the people of the world. And in each case, with floods, with the kinds of wonderful experiences as well as the dangers of historical waterworks as well as all life, there were passages of the Quran that really spoke to these aspects of the water system. And we began to weave together what we called the poetics and practicality of historic waterworks in that context. The next stage was to go back and look at all of the types of waterworks conservation that had occurred at the Taj Mahal, beginning only a few years after it was completed, after it had been built. There were leaks in the dome. There was flooding across the river. And the prince at that time, Aurangzeb, writes to his father and says, we've got problems. The dome is leaking, the garden is flooded. and we need to do some repair work at this place. And he later imprisoned his father in Agra Fort, for those who know the story, and it really took a sharp turn. But this was one of the last kind of strong filial favors that Aurangzeb did for his father, after which it turned nasty. And the record also breaks off, as you can see, in the 18th century. We have very little to go with, but then there's a case where some early colonial officers became interested in the Taj Mahal, and they began to commission infilling of the pietra dura semi-precious stonework around the monument and the cenotaph of the monument. And when a great monsoon rain came after that was done, all of that pietra dura work, it turned out, was not stonework at all, but it had been painted plaster, all washed out. Another failure of the conservation that was linked with a water resources connection. And subsequently, after the establishment of the Archaeological Survey of India, there are a whole array of different types of water conservation actions that we've been able to inventory and start to say, well, what are the different types of conservation issues that are being addressed here that relate to waterworks? And then to pull some of these together, thinking broadly in ways that go beyond the pools and fountains that I showed in the first slide, to encompass all of the different types of water experience that we've been able to kind of discern from both textual sources and then subsequent historical sources, and then also modern concerns. And that led to the development of this kind of conceptual model that we wanted to test at in the Taj Mahal complex. And the conceptual model is worth spending a little bit of time to describe what it conveys. It is trying to link various types of hydrologic process, broadly construed, with various types of human experience of water, also broadly construed. If we think of that first slide as referring to the kind of waterworks, the clear waters within the garden, which is really the kind of first thing that comes to mind for most visitors to this complex, it's a very kind of focused concern. And what this model is trying to do is saying that, well, really there's a much broader array of experience that's occurring that involves or entails water. Thanks. From the atmospheric to the alpine to the floods and rapid torrents to the sorts of biological water supplies that are taken up by plants and animals of the area as well as the complex. To various types of runoff, stormwater as well as sanitary wastewater, and that there's really a whole set of cycles of human experience and water resources processes that are interrelated and crucial for understanding the waters of these elaborate complexes. What I'm going to do in the course of tonight's talk is really try to illustrate or test, not in a formal way, but one that is more illustrative, the various aspects of this model, the one that we say, and I'm going to get off the misspelling of withdrawals as if it was written by a Texan, and have the proper spelling on the left-hand screen. So that as we step through the different types of water, we'll be able to kind of illustrate cases where the Taj Mahal is a good illustration. Now, is it visible again from the back, or do we need to focus? It's okay? Okay, well, let's then go back to the Mughal Empire itself and look at the regions of South Asia as they were defined institutionally in the late 16th century, and this applies through the 17th century during the construction of the Taj Mahal complex. We're most concerned with the Suba, or province of Agra, within which Agra city itself is the capital of the Mughal Empire in both the early 16th century and then again in the early 17th century. After the Taj Mahal is built, or as it's being completed, there are plans being made to shift the capital up to Delhi. But during, there is an overlap of the construction of the site with this being the center of an empire, and you really want to try to envision that landscape, which perhaps no image better than this 18th century, late 18th century map of Agra city is able to provide. It's a city that's arranged, organized spatially along the Yamuna riverfront, which is flowing in this fashion. And as you see along this river, all the way on each side, it's lined with gardens, so that there are gardens on both sides of the river lining the riverfront. There's a major fortress here, a Jami or Friday mosque here. The urban region is centered around the fort. And if you continue along the bend of the river, you arrive at the kind of grandest garden of all, which is the Taj Mahal Complex, including the Mehtab Bagh immediately across the river. This city was described by European travelers in the 17th century as superior in urban design and experience to London and Paris. Extraordinary level of urban design, and it's partly visible here with the satellite image that will help us to understand the different parts of the system. The tomb itself is raised on a marble plinth here, part of a larger platform. Just to the south of that is a large garden complex, walled, and one enters into that from a forecourt, or what's called a jilukhana, and below that a caravanserai, a traveler's rest stop, provisioned with all kinds of shops and resources for those who would come to visit and stay at the place. Up until the Smithsonian project, this garden across the way was seen mainly, well, there was the myth of a black Taj Mahal, which was known to be inaccurate, but it was seen as a separate type of complex. When you look at the dimensions being, however, exactly in alignment with the Taj Mahal, it's now believed that the complex really extended all the way across the river and that a river ran through it, quite literally, which is unprecedented. We don't know of another garden like this, and it's probably unlikely in most river systems. It's very rare to have a river channel that is this stable for a couple of centuries, one thinks about it. The conservation issues, the waterworks conservation issues, are really formidable in a place like this. We don't know, for example, whether this lotus foliated fountainhead within the Taj Mahal complex is original or was built or was replaced during the colonial period by either craftsmen copying an original or just substituting something of their own invention. And beyond that very material type of question, there's the questions of, well, how are these places experienced? And this reflection kind of gives a sense of just the power of the visual experience in each and every small pool within the complex. And to understand both in its own historical context, let alone even today, what a visitor experiences is a huge question for people who would strive to conserve a place like this. Well, the problems are very severe. Here's again a lotus foliated pool, and it's been excavated only 2 years ago, and the deterioration is very rapid, partly through the excavation, but also through brick robbing. Then when you get the repairs happening, the repairs are happening with masons who are using Portland cement concrete instead of canker lime, so that the repairs are compounding the problem. Then we can go on and say that if that weren't enough, the Yamuna River itself is so terribly depleted. This is the riverbank in a low flow season. And you can see there's barely a flow in this major tributary of the Ganga River in the pre-monsoon period. And what is in there today is, by and large, the industrial and urban wastewater from the cities of Delhi and Agra. So that the kind of water quality situation in this is horrific. And if that weren't enough, if we ask, well, what are the values for which the Taj Mahal and its waterworks are to be conserved? it's really very, very little understanding or work on the values that are held by those who visit, those who pray. We know some of the generic characteristics, but very, very little in the way of ethnographic work. There's been one major study and smaller articles to go along. Well, if we were trying to kind of pull together and do a more comprehensive approach with these conservation challenges in mind, one of the ways that we can start is to ask, well, what are some of the ways of approaching the Taj Mahal? And I've picked out 4 major approaches spatially. The most well-known is this axial approach where you come to arrive at the main axis in which this water channel is central. But a very common second approach would have been by river, both historically and up till very recent times, with flows from, this is seeing the Taj Mahal from Agra Fort. A third major view would come upstream, as would often happen on returns from campaigns in the Bengal and Bihar regions when returning to Agra. So looking downstream up towards the Taj Mahal. And the fourth historic view, and one that'll be more and more common as this Mehtab Bagh or Moonlight Garden is restored, is going to be an axial view from the opposite side of the river. And if you ask, what do these 4 images or approaches have in common? It's not going to be waterworks, it's not a river, it's not pools or fountains. What they have in common is the atmospheric conditions, which becomes immediately evident during the monsoon era. That's when you know that what we've called the light waters here of the atmosphere are as central to the aesthetics of this place as any other aspects of water. And the monsoon shows just how the monument, which was known in its own time as the illumined tomb, is really illuminated in different ways, in different atmospheric conditions. And those atmospheric conditions also include more cloudless skies in which the blue comes out and it stands in beautiful contrast with the dome. But even when you have cloudless skies, the humidity in this complex is often really quite substantial, and the microclimatic types of adjustments and management of that humidity was central to the way in which the complex was laid out. So we can think about visible and less visible types of atmospheric water, and then that relates us back to some of these issues of air quality. And this being a slide of the Taj Mahal in a joint fog and smog situation where haze is partly related to the aerosols in the atmosphere, but also related to the humidity conditions and fog in the area. It too has its own beauty to the extent that it's not generated by the refinery emissions, but you see that the complex goes dark against a light background and this type of thing, just the opposite of the way it is in the other types of lighting. So we really want to take light water seriously, and as do the advocates like M.C. Mehta, who helped establish this Taj Mahal trapezium, which is the management region for the city of, not for the city of Agra, for the Taj Mahal Complex and protecting it. And the industries within this trapezium region, a very large region, are all under various kinds of orders and restrictions to bring about air quality improvements that will protect this World Heritage Monument. So when you ask, is it possible to manage light waters and related atmospheric conditions, there's certainly an effort underway to do that. White water is not something common in the Taj Mahal complex, but it was very central to the original designs of the Mughal gardens that came from Central Asia and Afghanistan and northern Pakistan, where the kinds of cascades that one gets, the turbulence and running waters and rapids were just part of the garden aesthetic. But floods, 2 types of white water, call them, were present at the Taj Mahal, and one was flooding. And if one wonders in this era of depleted river flows what it was like what the flood regimes were like during earlier centuries, one need only look at the collapsed tank foundation here, which is about 1.5 meters thick of unbelievably strong masonry construction that was undermined by floods and collapsed. So extraordinary flood events. And the second major ways in which this kind of concept of whitewater was significant takes us back to this initial image. And everything you'll read from contemporary accounts of the Taj Mahal complex will reinforce this theme of whiteness, which was not associated solely with the kind of ethereal cloud-like imagery that we often emphasize today, but rather with profound grief. White is the color of mourning. White is Shah Jahan's hair and beard were said to have turned white from tears as well as from grief during this period. And just reflecting upon that aspect of, as well as the archaeological evidence, one could say that the decision to paint these channels blue was a grave error and could be one of the more easily rectified, but when you read the poets who say that rivers of tears flowed from the grief of this event and the death of Mumtaz Mahal, you understand that this is perhaps one of those rivers of tears that's being represented in the design of the garden, as well as its paradise-like symbolism. We also have, moving down our color spectrum here, associations of different types of blue with the water and its reflections in the river, which are just absolutely beautiful when the water quality is good and when the river is flowing smoothly. But all one has to do is look at those reflections during times when low flows and degraded flows exist to know that while in some cases a turbid river produces beautiful reflections, in other cases a depleted, turbid, polluted river produces a reflection, no doubt, but one that has very little satisfaction. And so we want to understand the ways in which these different transformations, natural hydrologic and humanly affected hydrologic processes in the middle and lower reaches of the river affect the experience of historic places such as this one, but throughout the city and in other types of cities as well. Well, so far we're just approaching the complex and we've considered the atmospheric waters, the river waters. We want to go on and realize that those river waters are also subject to management. It's not something that one has to give up and say this is unavoidable. Because the Yamuna River Action Plan has its own initiatives that are underway. There's a lot of criticism of the inaction of this plan, but there's it's not to be given up on, or if that plan is to be, then it's to be replaced by some other kind of river basin management that can rectify the problems that have been created in the middle reaches of the Yamuna Valley. It is a goddess like the Ganga. In fact, a parallel goddess, a very different type of goddess than the Ganga. Yamuna Devi was is after all the younger sister of Yama, of the underworld or of death. And so there's all kinds of historic associations and cultural associations with the river that correlate with the management of it in modern Indian society. We want to move to these green or biologic waters because they too are not often seen as water works. But the rich vegetation of the Taj Mahal was part of its historic condition, and this late 19th century photo indicates just how almost wild the vegetation was. Wilder than it would have been historically, to be sure, but certainly less not as tamed as what happened during the early 20th century as British administrators started to feel that broader lawns and views of the entire complex at a glance from the entry were desirable. And to this day, the types of flood irrigation that occur in a region of severe water shortage to supply those shortly mown doob grass lawns and the orchards that have no basis in the archaeological record of, or historical or cultural record of how the garden was laid out and experienced is a questionable type of management problem where the water is being supplied for extensive plantings, the cultural heritage significance of which has not been established. And that comes at a cost. It comes at a severe cost for local villagers. And when one looks at the water budget diagram for Agra, and you start to see the potential evapotranspiration in the yellow line and the monsoon precipitation, there's one brief instant at which the rain is falling so rapidly that it's flowing off-site, but the plants are only able to take up the water at the, well, they take it up at the full potential evapotranspiration rate but just for barely more than a month. And the rest of the year, we're talking about substantial deficits of water for planting, so that any water that is provided for plantings needs to be managed very carefully and consciously. So now we finally return to the situation where it's possible to think of these clear waters once again and in a new way, enveloped by the atmosphere, the plantings, and the river that we know flows beyond and below this monument. Just as in the Quran, it's said over and over again, a paradise underneath which rivers flow. There's very few cases where you could point to a clearer design that represents this more clearly than at the Taj Mahal. How are those clear waters experienced? You get the axial view when you first enter the complex, but almost immediately after that pause and that view, you step off axis, and you're always walking, if you're of high stature, that is, along this inner walkway here. If you're of our stature, you're walking along these outer walkways today, and that's the way the lower nobility and public visitors during the times of the Death Day celebration or Urus would have also been traveling with us out here. But you travel along the central channel, you see the water, the fountains play. These again, are they replicas? Are they original? Are they based on originals or not? No answers to these questions yet. But we notice them as we walk past them until we arrive at this central water tank at the very center of the garden with 5 fountains in the middle, lotus foliated again, and up until the late 19th century, lotus plants were growing in this tank. They were removed subsequently as seen as staining the marble. And when one looks off axis, they're both empty and without fountains. The secondary major cross-axis is empty, and there's a case of really where you can see water was being saved at the complex in historical times because there wasn't enough water to run the whole set of fountains and possibly to fill all channels at all times of the year. We continue up to the plinth of the Taj Mahal and to the pools that are immediately adjacent to the tomb. Once again, there are these beautiful shafts of marble. Water would have gone back up to about this level of the tank. And your curiosity has piqued you, and you start to wonder as you have experienced the full sequence of the water works, the clear water works within the gardens here. Where did this water come from? How was it brought to the garden? And to do that, you have to go down into the fountain pits. And that was possible across the river to actually go into, excavate, and understand how these garden fountains worked. That's a fountain pit. Regrettably, this is a cross-sectional drawing, which if you have a good imagination, my pointer is tracing the outline of the cross-section. The top of the earth is here, and this masonry goes down to what would have been a plaster bowl at the very base of the fountain that collected water, equalized pressure, and the bowl area was fed by about a 5-inch diameter terracotta pipe. These have not been seen before, and so to be able to see actually how these things were produced was so exciting that it leads you outside the garden, back to the river again. You wonder, how was water brought into the garden? What was the supply system that produced all of these effects that we've been talking about up till now? And about 15 years ago, the inlet to the water supply was still visible. Now it's covered with sediment, but it was excavated partially, and it was visible then. And water was brought directly in from the river, perpendicular to the channel. Some deposition of sediment would have occurred. There was then a stilling basin at the base of a very tall brick wall, and the water was lifted up that brick wall by a set of bullocks who would pull ropes, walking down a slope, and you can see that slope part of it behind the wall here. They walk back behind this wall, down slope. The leather buckets of water would come up to the top, be deposited in an aqueduct that traveled along the top of the wall. The bullock would walk back, and the leather bucket would go back down into the inlet. Ironically, the first Mughal emperor thought this was a very unsanitary practice. He just thought it was really because all of the bullock urine and feces would go back down into the water as well as they would walk, and their rope would go back and forth. And he just said, this should not be done. And it's interesting that in later Mughal engineering, they used this system and developed it and used it. And then the water was then carried along the top of the wall that supplies the system. And we're working on the hydraulics now of this wall to understand how much water could have flowed through the system and at what rates as it traveled around and reached a final set of stilling basins, which were crucial. You had to get the sediment out, and so there were multiple sediment deposition basins before water was taken in, originally via terracotta pipes here, but most recently, or rather in the colonial times, they just punched a hole through the wall with a cast iron pipe above. And then we're back into the clear water system. Our analysis continues with studies of stormwater runoff from the gardens in the complex and the types of drains that carried that water back to the river. Asking questions about what kinds of dilution would have occurred from those excess flows, and then where those dilution processes would have failed. And just take a moment to look at this low flow condition of the Yamuna River bed only a year ago. It breaks your heart to see a river in this condition, and also to know that the people who depend upon this for bathing, for drinking water supply, for crossing to go to work on a day-to-day basis, forget the tourists and what they don't like about it. The city is in great distress, as is all of the organisms in the river itself. If we ask kind of to try to wrap things up, because we've gone and followed this model from the atmospheric waters down through what in California would be called aguas negras from the borderlands area, Tijuana, San Diego, if you are in the colonias or other wastewater channels there. The black waters of those areas are very similar to what we find in the Yamuna River. I'd say that several key points come to mind in the way of summary conclusions from a study like this. The one is the hope that these waterworks, broadly defined, are something that would be seen as having significance beyond the individual channel, but kind of linking out to broader spheres of culture and environment. Secondly, that it's worthwhile and necessary to start thinking about these different dimensions of water resources experience more comprehensively and kind of coherently, where the linkages among them, which hydrologists and engineers have already help to establish in their own fields also need to be established within the fields of human experience and aesthetic experience, more specifically. We want to know that the kind of draw a conclusion, the third conclusion, that these types of experience that I've described in a very kind of capsule, brief way were very complex, emotionally as well as visually and aesthetically, so that they, in the original documents related to the Taj Mahal from the historical periods, you always had the references to grief that were mentioned earlier being associated with joy. So that, for example, if you think about the white marble cenotaph with its brilliantly colored flowers of inlaid stonework, the poets of that time said the writing that occurred on the white marble of grief was offset by the beautiful red and yellow flowers that bloom upon it. You have similarly a kind of turbulence and reflection. You have ideas that the poets are expressing that each of these pools and reflected images that we've described were a mirror of the mind and heart of anyone who looked at them and had the eyes to see. So they're extraordinary combinations of emotional and aesthetic experience that are embedded in this very simple type of model that we really want to understand, because they really will resonate with many of us as well in the types of experiences that we have related to water. We'll want to then also ask in what ways these types of shared experience relate to other types of places. And this is where I've got this great leap back to California here, and back to the United States more generally, where teams that are working, as the National Park Service did historically, and as our team in Illinois has been doing in the past 2 years, working again with the governments of Uttar Pradesh and India on a Taj Mahal National Park and the river improvement program. These need to be informed by a much, at the very least, I mean, this even doesn't seem adequate to the types of planning and design tasks that are being set before us. And it's very important to do that, because if we don't, then we might end up making big mistakes. And here's an example of the Moonlight Garden as it's recently been restored. And the restoration has positive qualities associated with it, but it occurred just several months prior to the conclusion of the Smithsonian team's scientific work that would have helped to identify what species, what water systems where. And it was done in part in a hurry because the Supreme Court litigation that we were talking about initially demanded that a response be made, that a green belt be created that would have, if followed to the letter of the law, cut straight through the middle of the forest, of the garden, having a forest on the far side and then just whatever vegetation existed on the near side. To prevent that, the Archaeological Survey of India leapt in with a plan and said, we were going to do something more appropriate. And they did this garden rapidly, hastily, and with no consultation, because they were fearful that they might get stopped. They implemented this, and now the question is, now that we have some better understanding of the place, what does it mean to conserve it now? And while that might be a question that would be discouraging at some point, we actually have some very inspiring kind of ways of trying to answer it, as to how one might say, well, let's use some of these trees that weren't originally part of the garden complex and use it as a nursery and transplant them out. And as plants die, they'll be replaced with the appropriate ones. And we start to think in terms of the decadal and centuries-long time scale that conservation always entails. It's not something that you fix with short projects or annual cycles of funding and project planning. Okay, now this is where we then come back and say, okay, well, I haven't worked in California in any project that's within California by itself, but I've worked in some in the Colorado River, as Matt was mentioning, and Glen Canyon Dam was the focus of one of them. And it struck me when preparing this paper for the colloquium, and it wouldn't have if I weren't coming here, that the emphasis on the waters of the canyon has been similarly fragmented among the physical, biological, and social sciences. Humanities are largely left out of a lot of the work here. But if one were to try to pull together for places like this a similar type of perspective, it would change things. For one thing, we would think differently. We'd certainly realize that the Grand Canyon just downstream from Glen Canyon Dam has been one of the most, what's the right word? It's been one of the greatest foci of atmospheric visibility research anywhere in the world from an aesthetic standpoint. So that anything that we were interested in with respect to haze and fog and all that imagery earlier, we would go and find a great reserve of information and analytic approaches that the Grand Canyon team has done over the past couple of decades. But we might also take a different view as to how we think about the aesthetics of water related to this structure, not only the conventional approaches, which limits it to flat water recreation behind the dam, trout fishing below the dam immediately, and then river rafting and various types of boating downstream, and start to think, wait a minute, all of those vegetation complexes, nourished or desiccated, that were along the floodplain are part of the water system, as are the atmosphere, as well as the waterworks, such as this one, but also many smaller waterworks of Native American settlements. There are 6 tribes that have associations with this stretch of the canyon. There's all sorts of ways in which a jointly cultural and eco-hydrological type of approach is warranted, indeed required, if we're to avoid the type of problem that we showed at the Maytop Bog in its garden, or even worse problems, such as this one. I don't know if you've ever seen this image, but if you read the caption, it says, "Think outside the rectangle." And believe me, if the human imagination goes in this direction, we'll have a lot to regret, as the grand kind of patio above the Grand Canyon start to be envisioned with their own waterworks, artificially pumping water up to the very top and then recirculating it with pumps all the way down. This is an advertisement. It's not a proposal. But it gives an indication of how one can go wrong. And we could find some concrete examples as well, and we wouldn't want to do that, because when one steps back again at this larger scale, just as we stepped back from the larger scale of the Taj Mahal waterworks to the urban riverfront as a design environment, and to the larger river basin and Taj Trapezium as environmental management context, then we immediately get a sense of how profound and important these types of kind of historic waterworks conservation, planning, and design really are. This work, both in the US and also in India and Pakistan, has led to some more synthetic publications on the role of water in garden archaeology, again trying to kind of bring together these different hydrologic, ecologic, and cultural aspects of conservation. And the hope is that just as one takes a ferry across the river day by day to get to the Taj Mahal, or looks at it from any of the angles that we mentioned, that travel across and through the region, from that region rather to our own in the Western United States or in other parts of the world, will really be informed by the types of interests and human concerns that we share in these exemplary cases of water and environmental design. But for every exemplary one, there's myriads and if not millions of smaller, but for those of us who inhabit them, just as significant places in which we would like to achieve those same ends. And the cross-cultural comparisons of the sort that we've striven to undertake between Asia and the US have had that broader aim in mind. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Jim. We have time for some questions.
Is the flow of the Yamuna River decreasing because of abstraction or for what reason?
It's a natural. Did you? Lights. There are natural low flow conditions, but the monsoon, exactly. But the depletions, the very substantial depletions, started with canal irrigation upstream and subsequent urban diversions upstream, have really depleted the river severely over the past century. So it's human development and depletion, and every one of them was contested, but unsuccessfully by the downstream users. Yes, awesome.
Does climate change have anything to do with it? Like when Taj Mahal was built, how was the climate? Was it different? And especially on the context of vegetation, because the vegetation now is so different. How long did that vegetation last? Or did climate change?
It's a very good question, but the good data on climate change come from varves and other lake deposits in Rajasthan and Haryana Pradesh, and they start to break off around 1500 because there's so much trade in plants that when you try to interpret pollen spectra, you've got so much exotica being planted that you can't sort out the climate change from, and so it's a big unknown as to what kinds of, to my knowledge, I haven't seen any past 500 years types of studies of climate variability. Yes.
Since the river is basically black water and not likely to become lighter, I assume, is there a deep aquifer underneath here that could be used to supply some of the potable water we need, never mind pure water?
Well, there are a variety of aquifers. There's an alluvial aquifer which is being tapped by hand pumps and shallow tube wells. There are deep aquifers that have been tapped, but they're at the level of depletion of groundwater supplies throughout the Doab region of northern India and western India is very frightening. This is the groundwater depletion. Marcus Mensch, who's from Berkeley, has studied this in the Indian context, and it is really at what are called the most severe rates. That opportunity has largely been tapped, but controlling, how much of it is used for a luxury hotel and what kinds of limits are put on tourism usage. This is a very important sphere of regulatory opportunity. Yes?
I come from the hard part of hydrological sciences, the brutal science and engineering. It's very refreshing to see the aesthetic component of waterworks. A friend of mine who works with Oxfam once made this argument that a part to make a waterworks sustainable is to build them beautiful.
Yeah, and thanks. That was one of the final conclusions in the paper. That was really to suggest that if we start to see the aesthetics of water as a driving force, in the same way that economics and politics of water are seen as driving forces for the management of the systems, then that would go a long way towards inspiring various types of conservation and wise use. Good.
Excellent progress.
Thanks.
Because of the poor water quality, is it having an effect on the corrosion of the foundation?
The foundation is extraordinary. For those who are the kind of structural engineers, if we have any structural engineers in the audience, I mean, this was built on piers, on brick piers that go down, I've forgotten, 20 meters, some of them, extraordinary depth along the riverfront, so that this face of the Taj Mahal is very much like almost a rock type of river bluff in its effect on channel flows. Now, it would be Matt who could tell us why a channel in an alluvial environment like this stays put, roughly. I mean, it floods all the time, especially on the opposite side of the river. But why this channel hasn't meandered as it has up at Delhi, moving about 1 kilometer away from Humayun's tomb and downtown Delhi, and in Lahore, where you have a similar complex, the River Ravi has moved over 1 kilometer away from the Lahore fort, which was the later capital of the Mughal Empire. This is an exceptionally stable channel, and the result of it is that it's the historic landscape along its riverfront is better preserved than anywhere else in the subcontinent.
Bring me along on your next trip and I'll figure that out.
It's a deal. We plan to work on this for a long time, and the surprises are just extraordinary. We went there in January and had heard nothing about new initiatives. And Bailey, you'll relate to this. The next thing I heard was our contact Nagra saying there's 36 bulldozers and drag lines in the riverbed, and they're kind of moving dirt, and they're kind of reworking the channel. They're building weirs above and below the Taj Mahal. Nobody can find out what the plan or technical sources is. Even the city authorities didn't know, so they stopped the work for 2 days until the center in Delhi said, no, this money is sanctioned. These people are moving. And so now we have to find out what's going on. And that's been the history, really, for such a long time, just as it is here. If you ask what's going on with the Colorado River, well, try to find out. It's a full-time occupation. Thanks very much, folks. And Bailey?
Just one last question. So much what we've been talking about is a synthetic approach that looks at all levels and different uses. How do you overcome the compartmentalization of the Indian bureaucracy and the overlapping ministries and layers of responsibility to help engender this synthetic approach when things are so cut up and so at cross purposes and turf battles and all of the rest?
Great question.
And because this is, I mean, the short answer is I don't know. But there are some partial exceptions, and I point to, in this field, the exception of Humayun's tomb, in which it's a joint Aga Khan Archaeological Survey and Oberoi Hotel financed conservation program that's going on for the past 3 years. They've accomplished an enormous amount, and it's a combination of, well, it's a matter of organizing power, the landscape power, and the various participants that are involved, and having, and I mean that sense of power and the kind of legitimate power as the authority to do things in an organized way. And another lesson that comes from, another key ingredient that comes from another sphere of water management is that sometimes you want to be working not at a place like the Taj Mahal, which is like the, at least arguably a symbol of India as a nation, but you want to be working in the Humayun's tomb. Or you want to be working not on the Colorado River main stem, but in the San Juan, where the politics aren't so intense that you actually have sometimes more scope to accomplish things. And the proposals by some of your colleagues, again, from Berkeley ERG graduates, that some of the best opportunities for collaborative work in the Ganges Basin, Ganges-Brahmaputra Basin between India and Bangladesh were not on the Ganges main stem, but on the 50-some medium-scale tributaries that are shared by the two countries, because the two countries just would finally kind of give up and get tired of trying to squelch a kind of track 2 type of approach to collaborative water management. So it is possible One has to be creative. The windows open and they close, and that's, you just keep involved, yeah.
If I could ask you a little bit more about the white water and the clear water. I may have missed it, but could you elaborate a little bit on what sort of reaction you think may have been intended for the white water to elicit in the way it was used in the complex?
It's a good question. The white water as a in this particular case is very different from that which was rippling down that cascade. And there's Yasser Tabah has written this beautiful article on the kind of meditative qualities of water that's passing out of usually a channel in a wall, down a cascade into a pool, and along a channel. But in this case, this meditation on death would have been one of the associations, would have been the association with the color white, on purity, which was associated in all of the historical texts, the purity of Taj Mahal. And would be a second major association. But then that would be lightened by these sprinkling fountains that would give a completely kind of mixed feeling. And then when you were, and it's precisely that mixture of emotions, of aesthetic emotions, that the designers and the early visitors wanted to evoke. They didn't want a simple, single emotion, because that's not what life is like.
Sort of related question. Given the importance of the Taj Mahal as a symbol of India, and the importance of the river as an element in it, from what you said, it doesn't sound like there's a strong political will to restore the integrity of the river, even if it's just from the aesthetic point of view. You know, if it is in fact black water, and I know there's a smell associated with that, is that not a bad enough environmental condition to bring the government to look at how water is diverted upstream?
I think the best thing I could refer people to is a recent book that came out just a couple of months ago that studies these contamination issues in the Ganges. And so there the river is sacred far more kind of comprehensively. And Kelly Alley, who wrote this volume after over a decade's work on where wastewater meets the Ganges, really studies how the ideas of purity and cleanliness are very different phenomena. So that purity and cleanliness are seen in different ways, and so the river can be ritually pure while it's unclean. And kind of in terms of one's consciousness, this is these very different ways of thinking. Or they can acknowledge pollution of the river while not feeling compelled to address that, because what one's really concerned with is its purity, which can't be compromised, or which can be compromised in other ways, but not necessarily through the pollution. And some similar types of issues and attitudes may help account for the Yamuna River context as well. But then if you add to that you've got megacity upstream of Delhi desperately needing water, and then some real heavyweights politically in terms of the users, as well as it being the national capital. The idea of having people who don't have sufficient access for their industries or for the basic consumption on a daily basis in the capital, vis-a-vis the conditions outside the Taj Mahal, it's not a contest. But then somebody like a minister of in this case culture, gets it into, he says, I have the authority, I'm sending those bulldozers down there. They're going to clean it out, they're going to do this and that and the other thing, and you better hope that they don't bulldoze out the historic foundations along the way, which they sometimes also do. So it's a political a challenge of extraordinary complexity, but where isn't it, you know?
Good, thanks very much.
Thank you.